Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Audrey Monette. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of Projects and Research for the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. On behalf of CMNCP, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on conducting community consultations. The event is part of our ongoing Future of Safe Community speaker series, and it also happens to be the official launch of our brand new Practitioner guide for crime prevention and community safety plans, so that the community consultations in that context. Before we get started today, I do want to start us off in a good way by doing a land acknowledgement. So I am joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation, colonially known as Gatineau, Quebec. I do want to encourage everyone to maybe post in the chat the traditional territory from which you're joining us, and that way we can recognize Indigenous territory from coast to coast. I do this acknowledgement of the land as a small act of reconciliation to honor the land and Indigenous heritage and history. I do also want to reiterate that when we talk about community safety and other related topics like we will be discussing today, it's crucial to recognize that a number of these issues disproportionately impact Indigenous communities across the country, and that a lot of those challenges can be explained in part by intergenerational trauma, as well as negative life experiences that are the legacy left by residential schools and colonization. And we're going to continue to consider those systemic barriers and those inequities when conducting work related to community safety and well-being at the community level. So before we get started with this session today, I do want to give a little bit of background information on the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention for those of you who may not be familiar with the organization. So we are a membership-based, not-for-profit organization, and we really aim to serve as a community of practice that's focused on supporting communities to prevent crime, to increase community safety, and to reduce violence. To do that, we promote an approach that's very much community-led, that's multi-sectoral, and that really includes a range of preventative measures in key sectors. So sectors like education, health and social services, child welfare, housing, and many, many more. And so what's important, I think, is the fact that prevention and community safety are not imagined only as a policing issue, but really as a collective responsibility that brings together those multi-sectoral partners to identify the challenges and to identify the solutions collectively. So over the past couple of years, we've seen a steady increase in our membership. So we now represent, I think, over 100 rural and urban communities across the country. So that represents over 50% of the population. Our smallest community has a population of about 800 people, and the largest is the city of Toronto with over 6 million. In terms of some of the work that we do, we really focus on facilitating opportunities for cities and communities across the country to share their practice. We like to say that we're a community of practice by practitioners for practitioners. So we provide things like training in crime prevention and community safety. We do have a training that has a specific rural lens as well. We do a lot of webinars like the event that we're doing today. And we publish different documents to summarize and mobilize knowledge, evidence, and research related to community safety. And then we also sometimes work directly with communities on a project-based basis to help them develop community safety and well-being plans and do other more specific projects. So one key topic of interest that actually came up quite a bit among our members in the past couple of years was the link between social challenges and community safety, particularly given the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that topic actually became the focus of our upcoming 2022 annual conference. It will be held virtually again this year from November 8th to 10th. And the conference is going to focus on a number of leading edge questions that are designed to inspire and provoke conversation in creating safer communities across the country. So throughout the 3 conference days, there's going to be an opening keynote address, a number of thematic sessions with different panel presentations, and then a closing keynote panel as well. And then we're trying to build in some different opportunities for engagement and networking, some workshops and coaching sessions as well. that will be built through the 3 days. So our opening keynote presenter is Jaap de Woord, who is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Security and Justice. And then the welcome remarks will be delivered by Juma Asiago from UN Habitat Safer Cities program. And then in terms of the different thematic sessions, I listed a couple of them on the screen here. So you see there's going to be a number of panels on different topics. So topics like houselessness, substance use, which is going to be moderated by journalist Travis Lupik. He's also author of the book A Tale of Two Cities. We'll have a session on mental health. That one is going to include a number of presenters who bring in an anti-racism and a cultural awareness lens, street sex work, non-police-based alternatives to mental health crises. That session is going to be moderated by Dr. Livingston from St. Mary's University. He's also the lead on a new website, justmentalhealth.ca, that documents different non-policed approaches to mental health. The new Toronto-based pilot project is also going to be featured in that panel. And then there's going to be sessions on crime prevention through environmental design, ACEs, and a number of different topics like that. And each session is going to have panelists from a broad range of backgrounds, so practitioners, service providers, people with lived experience, researchers, and so on and so forth. So for those of you who are interested in attending the conference, we'll post a link in the chat to the website page that has all the details on the date and registration. We have some early bird tickets on sale now. And if you look at the follow-up email from this session, you just might find a promo code that'll be available for a couple hours after the session. Just for the people that attend the webinar today, we'll have a special discount after the session. And if you also would be interested in receiving some more updates on the conference, you can also post your email in the chat. We'll take some notes of that and then make sure to communicate some more specific details. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Katie, to introduce the topic of today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, Audrey. Just going to share my screen real quick here. Okay. Can everybody see the presentation? Yes, awesome. All right, so as Audrey mentioned, my name is Katie. I'm the manager of projects and knowledge development with the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. I am joining you today from Kitchener, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. And I want to officially welcome you to our webinar, as Audrey mentioned, for the official launch of our Practitioner Guide on Community Consultations for Crime Prevention, Community Safety, and Wellbeing Plans. So we developed this document as a resource for communities seeking input from their own residents as part of the development of their own crime prevention, community safety, and well-being plans. And the information from local residents and members of the community is really important in this process because it helps plan developers understand strengths and challenges from a local context and ensure that the priorities that are identified and subsequent actions to address them actually reflect the community and local needs. So this document is based on our own work with communities, along with feedback from the people that we've worked with, practitioners, and general best practice overall. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the key points highlighted in the document. And then I'm going to turn it over to our panel of 4 practitioners who have kindly volunteered their time to be here today and will be sharing their experience working on CSWB plans within their own communities. So one of the most important questions to consider when planning community consultations is who to actually speak to. So we all know it's important to capture a diverse range of voices and perspectives in the community consultation process because communities are made up of all sorts of different voices and individuals. And therefore, this is an important part of developing a CSWB plan. And so while ultimately this decision will depend on different factors like the makeup of the community, resources, the availability of different groups in the community, and so on and so forth, there are sort of 3 general groups that we identified that are recommended to be consulted with. And so the first is local stakeholders, practitioners, and service providers. So these individuals work on the front lines in the community and therefore have a strong understanding of local strengths and challenges and strong relationship with members of the community as well. And so as a result, they can provide great insight on what should be included as local priorities, as well as recommendations to address them. So that's the first group. The second includes equity deserving groups and people with lived or living experience. So these groups are often overlooked in planning and decision-making processes, despite the fact that they tend to experience higher levels of marginalization. And so as a result, it's recommended to consult with them in focused consultations, excuse me, to ensure that their voices are elevated in the community engagement process. And some examples include Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people with lived and living experience, and so on. And then finally, there may also be other groups within the community who don't fall under the first two categories, but may be important to consult with. So for example, segments of the population that speak different languages. So in one community, we had a specific consultation with the Francophone community. Others include the business community, military families, perhaps student neighborhood associations, and so on. So ultimately, the goal then is to identify different groups living within the community and to try and capture as many perspectives as possible to get a real comprehensive understanding of local context related to community safety and well-being. So I'm now going to focus more on the actual consultation planning and data collection process and highlight the 5 key recommendations that are included within the practitioner guide. So the first is work with local partners. So as an external organization coming into communities to work on CSWB plans, something that we at CMNCP have found to work well in the community consultation process is working with local partners. So once the groups being consulted have been identified, it's helpful to reach out to people who are actually then connected to that community. So for example, this could be an executive director of an organization that works with a particular group, or a local Indigenous leader, or even someone else who is just very well connected to that particular segment of the population. And so having these partners is valuable for a few different reasons. So first, they can provide guidance and feedback on the best way to approach and engage community members. So for example, they may have suggestions on the best place to hold the session, who should facilitate. They may even be willing to facilitate themselves. And what type of honorarium should be offered for participants, and ultimately to ensure that the session remains safe and meaningful for participants. They can also help with recruitment given their connections to the community. So often we have them at CMNCP, we've had partners send out invitation emails for the consultations on our behalf, since these individuals have pre-existing relationships with the people we're hoping to speak with. And they can also be a source of validation for the process. So given their existing relationships and the understanding that if they're sending the email out, they have probably overseen the process and can essentially validate it, the participants may feel more comfortable participating in the consultation process and then sharing their thoughts as well. So that's the first recommendation. The second is be flexible. So as we all know, even the best plans don't always come to fruition, and the same occurs with community consultations. So again, we at CMNCP have worked with several communities on CSWB plans and have found that adjustments often need to be made to the initial plans as the process goes along. So for example, consultations have been added as additional groups have been identified. Different formats have been adopted if scheduling became a challenge. So in one location, we ended up having to take an online approach and create a SurveyMonkey platform instead of having a conversation. And timelines have been adjusted based on various unanticipated events. So in one location, we had to speed up the consultation process because they were entering a red zone due to an election. And in others, we've had delays due to things like COVID or extreme weather. So the point here is that it helps to enter this process with a general plan and outline, but it is important to anticipate that there's a good chance things may change and to have that flexibility. And so the third recommendation is to ask a few simple questions. So it's really important to ensure that during these consultations, the questions you're asking are clear, concise, and general. So these questions on the slides are the ones that we typically at CMNCP tend to use in our own consultations. And so as you can see, they're very general. And this is by design because it gives participants an opportunity to speak to any topic that they find relevant, but doesn't direct the conversation in a particular way or make assumptions about what might be the key challenges in the community. And you'll see that there are also only 3 of them. And again, this is very intentional. So we typically use these questions in groups of 10 to 12 participants max, and about a 90-minute session. And from our experience, having 3 questions in this format tends to give a sufficient amount of time for participants to share their thoughts without feeling rushed or overwhelmed with the number of questions that we're asking them. So this is what we tend to use because it seems to work well for us. And we've also kept the language very simple because it's really important to use questions that the average person can understand. So avoiding the use of jargon, for example, or complicated terms. And not only does this help participants feel more comfortable as if they understand what's being asked them, it also helps ensure that the responses that you're getting actually reflect the information that you're seeking from the session. And finally, while there may be some minor adjustments to the language from one session to another, it's really helpful if we can keep the questions as consistent as possible across the sessions, because it allows the data to be compared much easier and assessed thematically to identify trends amongst the community as a whole. And so the 4th recommendation is incorporate the do no harm principle. So as with any type of research or data collection involving humans, it's very important to ensure that no harm comes to participants during the consultation process. And so the guide has a much more in-depth discussion of this, but some examples of ways to prevent this include things like providing information letters that include all the details of the session so that participants attend being fully informed of the process, what it involves, the expectations, and why it's occurring. Another way to reduce or avoid harm, hopefully, is adapting the approach to the needs of the group. So this may involve things like having an ASL interpreter present, scheduling at a time that's convenient. So perhaps outside of school hours, if you're looking to speak with youth, or on a weekend, if you're looking to speak with individuals who tend to work 9-to-5 jobs. As well, providing contact information for anyone who may need crisis support during or after this session is important, especially if there's anticipated topics that might be triggering or people might not feel great talking about afterwards, or the potential that they may need support. It's important to have that information ready to go before the session, just in case. Offering honorariums to compensate participants for their time. And also something that we tend to do is following up with participants after the session. So at CMNCP, we always send a follow-up email to allow participants to review the notes that we've taken during the session. So this really demonstrates transparency and lets them see what we wrote down, and then giving them an opportunity to review that, let us know if that captured what was discussed, and also an opportunity to share additional thoughts and feedback if something came up after the session that they felt like they would like to share. And then finally, the last recommendation is to use different consultation approaches. So adding to what I mentioned earlier about flexibility, previous experience has taught us that while a general focus group format can generate great discussions and important information in some cases, in other situations, different formats may be more suitable. So while a typical focus group involves the researcher, or in our case, a member of the CMNCP team or the project team, or a different organization facilitating the conversation, this may not always be the best option for every group. So for example, among groups who may feel more comfortable speaking with someone they know, it may be better to have the conversation facilitated by a local partner. So in one community, for example, we wanted to speak with newcomers and immigrants, and instead of CMNCP facilitating the conversation, we actually had the consultation facilitated by a local ESL teacher towards her classroom, because she had those pre-existing relationships with the students. And then we from CMNCP were just there and took notes and observed the session. And then another option is community-led consultations, where a partner facilitates the conversation without CMNCP or an external party present at all. And this approach tends to be preferred by groups who have historical distrust towards law enforcement and other mainstream organizations, or perhaps those who may be concerned about sharing personal stories with people they don't know. So for example, living experience with substance use. And then beyond these approaches, there are, of course, other ways to collect information that have also been used. So for example, in one community, rather than a consultation process, we had youth actually go out in the community and take photos of areas they enjoy and areas that they have concerns with, because we decided that this would be a more meaningful approach to gather this information from them. So there are some other examples in the document, but the point here is to be creative and work with the community to identify the best way to create a meaningful engagement session. So that's a very brief general overview of the document. I know it's a lot of information, so please feel free to refer to the full practitioner guide for more details and sample materials. But now I am very happy to turn it over to our panel for our panel presentation. So just a note, we have allotted time for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you could please hold your questions until all of the panelists have finished their presentations. We want to make sure they all have their full time, and then we will deal with the questions afterwards. That being said, as we go, if something comes up, please feel free to type a question in the chat and we'll address that once we get to the Q&A period. So our first presenters come to us from Strathcona County in Alberta. So Laurel Sakalak is a policymaker and social policy researcher whose work is focused on conducting engagement and research about the social needs and experiences of diverse people. She is inspired in her work by the opportunities it provides to contribute to positive social change. Laurel is currently a senior social policy and innovation advisor at Strathcona County and an adjunct professor in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Alberta. In her policy work, she engages with community members and supports design of public policy that reflects their voices and context expertise. Her recent projects include support of the creation of a youth strategy for Strathcona County that is youth and young adult led, and support of the creation of Strathcona County's developing community safety and well-being strategy. In her academic work, she instructs courses focused on family diversity, structural inequalities, and social issues, and she's a guest lecturer about social innovation and collaborative cross-sector service and policy design. Building on her expertise in these areas, she's also currently involved in policy-focused research projects directed at creating inclusivity. And she is a member of the Global Research Network on the Economic Empowerment of Women, which is working collaboratively across nations to address a data gap and develop policy recommendations related to initiatives that support women's economic equality. And in addition to Laurel, we also have Michelle Jen. She is the manager of community and social innovation for Strathcona County Family and Community Services. And in this role, Michelle works alongside the community to support strategies, concepts, and ideas to address complex social issues in alignment with Strathcona County's social framework outcomes. A part of her portfolio includes supporting the work of Strathcona County's Drug Strategy Committee. Prior to her current role, Michelle worked in policy and public engagement with the province of Alberta for approximately 10 years, developing strategies and public participation platforms using systems thinking and participatory design for complex social challenges. She continues to support the Alberta court system in family justice reform as part of a large-scale systems change process. And in her spare time, Michelle enjoys hiking, running, and small-scale community projects. So thank you both very much for being here, and I will now turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, CMNCP and Katie, Felix, and Audrey for this opportunity to share about our community's work conducting a community safety and well-being engagement to inform our strategy. We're honored to be here and looking forward to hearing your questions and feedback about our engagement. And we're looking forward to hearing about the work of other presenters, Kelly and Leroy. We'd also like to thank our colleagues, Kristen Berry, Stacey Peterson, for their work on the presentation. And we'll be sharing with you today our colleague, Lona Larian, for her work facilitating the development of principles that we'll be focusing on today. So we'd like to open with our Strathcona County land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that Strathcona County is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 2 and 4. Strathcona County honors the First Peoples of this land. We recognize that we stand upon land that carries the footsteps of Cree, Métis, and Blackfoot, amongst many other nations who have been here for thousands of years. Therefore, Strathcona County has an inherent responsibility to foster healthier relationships with First Peoples and further the calls to action as outlined by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We'd like to begin our presentation with some context and background of our Community Safety and Wellbeing Project. In 2016, a large community engagement was held in our municipality, Strathcona County, called Community Talk, a social framework that included community outcomes grounded in the voices and priorities of our community members was developed from the engagement findings. Based on the feedback from the public, community leaders also concluded that it was time for an intentional shift in how organizations work together on what mattered most to residents. The social framework leadership table is a group of community leaders who came together and continue to regularly meet to further the work of the framework and develop collaborative strategies and responsive projects that have resulted in increased community capacity for collective action. We felt it was important to share this context about the framework because throughout our community safety and well-being engagement and other work on the project, we have noticed that the base of relationships, as well as the practice we have had in acting together to meet community needs, has been an important precursor to the success of our work. We began work on our community safety and well-being engagement following a motion from our council that came forward after a recommendation from a municipal COVID response task force to consider beginning work on such a strategy for the county. A preventative systems approach to community safety and well-being. We drew on the community strengths built through the social framework journey to create an engagement focused on capturing a diversity of experiences related to safety and well-being, and also diversity of lived professional and content expertise about safety and well-being. I'd now like to hand it over to Laurel to review guiding principles.
Thanks, Michelle, and hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today. One of the learnings that was carried over from the social framework was to use a principle-driven approach to complex systems level work. And so we followed a similar approach to developing and implementing our community safety and well-being, or CSWB, engagement. All of our engagement process decisions were guided by a set of collaboratively developed principles. And principle-driven approaches to policy development, you might know, are becoming more common because this approach is recognized to provide nimbleness and the ability to pivot as required, while the principles also act as a compass that helps to keep things on track. Principles are clear patterns of shared intention and commitments, often reflective of shared values. We'd like to share 4 of our principles with you. Then we'll talk about how these principles guided decisions about our CSWB engagement approach and methods. The principle space for emergence and reflection is a commitment to a learning orientation and being open to pivoting as we learn new things. We commit to diverging and converging in our work. We gather as much information as we can, and we dive in as deeply and broadly as possible. We reflect on what we're learning, and we develop plans only after we've had time for reflecting and reacting together. The principle equity as a process encompasses the idea of nothing about us without us. It's also about a learning stance focused on our shared humanity and our approaching our work in the community with compassion and humility. A third principle, attention to accountability and action, is about ensuring that our work is evidence-based and that it is leading to meaningful action. What we mean by this principle is that we have a shared awareness of the evidence bases we are collectively building and choosing to probe and examine. This includes that we recognize lived experience as critical evidence and expertise in our work. We're also action-oriented, and we take actions as they spiral out from the process of learning together. In other words, we don't necessarily take a linear approach. For example, actions have spiraled out of our engagement process, even though we aren't formally in our priority setting and action phase of our CSWB project. A final foundational principle is truth testing and being open and committed to the story of the real and the story of aspiration. This principle names our commitment to holding a space to hear all truths, reflect upon all truths, question our own assumptions about the real, and about aspirations or goals for the community. We'll now walk through a discussion of how these principles guided decisions about the individual components of our engagement or consultation process. So decisions about our sample or who to engage with, the structure of our sessions, our engagement questions, the analysis process, and also our process for reporting back and ensuring accountability. We put the principles in gray on the slides to show which key principles were applied at each stage of the process. Who to engage was guided by the principle space for emergence and reflection. And before we began our engagement, we worked with organizations and agencies connected to community members to create a stakeholder list. We continuously added to this list by reaching out to local informal groups and also by asking engagement participants in their engagement sessions, who else should be a part of this conversation? Specific attention was paid to invite and create space for participants with lived and living experience. Our emerging stakeholder list included healthcare workers, first responders, schools, faith communities, seniors groups, rural and urban community groups, and networks of new Canadians and immigrants, as well as others. We tapped into professional expertise, content expertise, and lived experience from different viewpoints in the system. We ended up meeting initially with over 300 individuals from 66 different groups and organizations. Our engagement is not yet complete. We're now in a phase of our engagement that is primarily focused on capturing lived and living experience. And the actions resulting from reflection on the principle of emergence and the inclusion of additional confirmations focused on lived experience has created a shift in our CSWB conversation from I have noticed or what has been shared with me to I have experienced, and the sharing of personal stories that added depth and understanding to the current context of safety and well-being. When making decisions about how we would engage, including the location and structure of engagement sessions and the facilitation approach, we drew heavily on the principle of equity as a process. And we defined equity as the process a group consistently engages in to ensure that people with marginalized identities have the opportunity to grow, contribute, and develop, regardless of their identity. An illustration of our use of this principle is our engagement with the African community in Strathcona County. The community took the lead in planning the engagement conversation, where and when the group would come together, who and how participants would be invited, and they set the tone for the conversation. Our role was solely to ask the questions to center the conversation around the topic of CSWB. Important findings emerged from that conversation about race, culture, inclusion, and exclusion in our community. Another critical element of an engagement is the set of engagement questions that will be asked, as Katie mentioned in her introduction to the session today. We reflected on the principle of truth testing and being open to the story of the real when designing our engagement questions. The principle of equity as a process was also very important in this stage. We generated a short set of semi-structured questions that provided boundaries for the conversation, but also allowed discussion to be participant-led. We recognized that the participants were the experts. They were sharing their expertise on the topic of CSWB with us. We followed their lead and we asked questions that moved the conversation more deeply into the places that participants wanted to share and explore. Facilitators used probes such as tell me more and how did you feel in the moment? In engagement conversations with some established committees, our team used a causal layered analysis technique to identify underlying contributors to safety and well-being. And the image on this slide is a visual depiction that we created of one of the causal layered analysis conversations. The engagement process and questions were designed to shift and adapt to the flow of the conversation and also to evoke trust building and storytelling by participants. The analysis process is also a critically important part of an engagement or consultation. The content, the structure, and the meaning of the information and knowledge that is shared from the engagement is shaped and determined by the data analysis team. We were guided by the principles of emergence and reflection and also truth testing when developing our analysis process. A guiding question throughout the process was, are we staying true to the voices of participants and their truth as shared with us? We used a process called qualitative content analysis to analyze our data and determine our findings and our themes. We don't have time to talk about this process in detail. However, we'd like to emphasize one important aspect. It begins with open coding. That is, we created codes for each individual thought shared by engagement participants. We sometimes describe this part of the process as going through the data with a fine-tooth comb. This is an important step in the analysis process because it results in the findings of the engagement, the categories and themes, being determined by the voices of engagement participants and not by the analysis team. In other words, we didn't predefine themes in any way. The themes emerged from the coding structure. An additional important aspect of our analysis process was that it was carried out by a diverse group of people, some in policy-related positions and some in frontline service delivery positions. This resulted in multiple perspectives shaping the analysis. Our individual assumptions and biases were tested through the process so that we could draw on a more holistic understanding that stayed true to the voices of participants. And now I'm going to turn things back to Michelle to close things.
Thank you, Laura. A key step coming out of an engagement report back and also developing actions grounded in the engagement findings. An important principle guiding this step in our engagement process has been attention to accountability and action. We have recently completed a draft of our What We Heard report. We were hoping to share it with you today, but it is still in the design phase, and so we can share it at a later date. Our approach to our What We Heard demonstrates a commitment to accountability in a few ways. First, it's a report back to our community about findings. We're also going to hold sessions with participants and ask them, did we get this right? Are our conclusions accurate from your perspective? Second of all, the conclusions and findings shared in our What We Heard are built around participant voices and expertise. We build a story around the quotes, and every component of the story is backed by the participants' words. An important part of accountability is also taking action. We've had a number of actions spiral out of our engagement, as Laurel had mentioned. For example, during our engagement, we heard about particular needs that youth and young adults had raised regarding mental health supports. They talked about their priority of having more mental health supports available in spaces where they were already comfortable hanging out and spending time. In Strathcona County, there is a youth hub, a safe, accessible, and inclusive space for youth. Responding to the engagement findings, arrangements were made with community partners running the youth hub, Boys and Girls Club, and to have a mental health capacity builder, which is a person who supports mental health challenges from our team, come consistently one evening per week to the youth hub to make connections and support youth and provide mental health supports as required. It's just an example of how we were so readily able to respond given the proximity of this work to the actual issues. Outside of the work of the county, another action that has spiraled out of the engagement is our African community has created connections and has formed a group. Stakeholders who were not connected within the community network are now talking, looking for ways to come together in meaningful ways. We'd like to end by sharing 3 lessons learned. First, we've learned about the power of principles. Principles show up in invisible ways in the culture of a group. They become the cultural layer focused on how we work together. They show up in our practice in the most meaningful way. This can be hard to put words to, and we tried to capture it in the examples we've shared about the decisions we've made about our engagement process. We'd also like to emphasize the importance of putting as much emphasis on designing the analysis process as on other components of the engagement. Following a systematic analysis process with space built in to examine the data from multiple perspectives and challenge assumptions about the data from different perspectives can be an invaluable component in ensuring that the analysis results are grounded in the participant voices. Participant voice can be lost in the analysis stage if the worldview of the analysts and their assumptions about the data can potentially drown out the perspectives of those participants. That leads us to our final lesson learned, being reflective about how participant voices will be foregrounded in all stages of the engagement. It is critically important to truly learning about the diversity of experiences that exist in our communities related to community safety and well-being. Thank you so much, and we look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle and Laurel. Very much appreciate the presentation. I think it's great that you identified those guiding principles ahead of time to make sure that they guided the process going forward. So now we will move on to our next panelist. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick here and introduce Kelly Husak. So Kelly has lived and worked in community for most of her life. Following convocation from the Faculty of Kinesiology at the University of Regina in 2015, she took on the role as Executive Director for an inner city community health clinic in Regina's North Central neighborhood known as Search. It was her experiences that she gained here that continues to drive her work and passion for community well-being. In addition, Kelly has held numerous roles throughout the community, including working as a qualitative HIV research assistant, youth employment business mentor, and community organizer for the Regina Blue Dot movement. In the fall of 2018, Kelly then moved to Toronto to further her education by pursuing a master's in public policy at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, with a specialization in public health policy at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. In addition to her studies, she spent her free time exploring many events and sites throughout the city of Toronto and continued volunteering with the local Blue Dot movement group. She remained active on campus, leading student groups, including the Public Good Initiative, which is a student-led pro bono nonprofit consulting initiative, as a student director, and was elected Director of Finance for the Master of Public Policy Student Association. She also worked as a communications coordinator with the Urban Policy Lab at the University of Toronto and participated in a number of case competitions. She also completed a co-op internship with the Ontario Public Service in 2019 in the Ministry of Education, working on files related to student safety and health. And following graduation from the MPP program, Kelly returned home to Regina and immediately began working for the City of Regina in her current position as policy analyst in April of 2020, the role she continues to work in to this day. So thank you, Kelly. We're very happy to have you as well. And I will now pass it over to you for your presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Katie, and thank you everyone for allowing me the opportunity to present here today and share a bit of our experience in developing our safety and well-being plan, the very first one for Regina, but also the consultation processes that led to the development of it. So I would just like to begin by acknowledging the land from which I am joining here today, which is the Treaty 4 territory. This treaty is a treaty signed by 35 First Nations from across southern Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta and Manitoba. It is also the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and is placed on the homeland of the Métis Nation. To situate ourselves here today, I just wanted to begin with giving a very brief background on how our project came to be and led to the steps that we took in regards to the consultation conducted through our community safety and well-being planning process. Our story really begins with a motion that was brought forward by Regina City Council members regarding community safety and well-being in November of 2019. This motion directed administration to return to council in 2020 with a proposed approach to develop a community safety and well-being plan for Regina. This led us to be able to initiate a procurement process that led to the eventual hiring of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, and we kicked off the project at the end of 2020. You will note this also is taking place amidst the backdrop of COVID, which will come up later on in my presentation. From here, and in conjunction with CMNCP, we began an in-depth community safety assessment with several data collection methods that were analyzed and used to inform our CSWB plan. The first of which that occurred and continued throughout the duration of the project was the quantitative data assessment. This included analyzing a number of data sets from publicly available sources, sector partners, as well as data sets from a number of our partners in community. This was heavily supported by Katie at CMNCP and provided a snapshot understanding of where we were at that time as a community. This was also paired with our qualitative data assessment that started with the conducting of a CSWB survey that took place in early of 2021 from February to April. Partway through the offering of this survey, we also released a tool called Places I Love. And this was an option that allowed residents to go online and spatially locate things that they enjoyed about their city and the things that they would like to see improved to enhance their safety and well-being. Also, as part of this qualitative data assessment, a number of community consultations were completed. In order to ensure that broad range of perspectives were captured in our data collection process, consultations were held with several community groups. The approach was purposely designed in order to highlight voices and perspectives of those who are at greater risk of marginalization and who are also overlooked often in community consultation processes. And this was mentioned by Katie earlier. Our starting point was about a list of 6 to 8 different groups that CMNCP had developed based on their past experience in creating safety and well-being plans across Canada. We then worked with our project team to flesh out and identify additional key groups that would be critical to engage in our community. And we noted at this point that sometimes a single consultation with these groups would not suffice. As a result, our list of groups quickly grew from that 6 to 8 to 12 key stakeholder groups that you can see here on the slide. And within some of these groups, numerous sessions were in fact held to be able to hold space for a large range of voices and perspectives. However, as we did continue to explore how we would work to engage these various groups, it also became evident to us that within the context of COVID and the restrictions that were in place at the time, we needed to conduct many of these consultations virtually. Paying attention to how we were conducting these consultations was also top of mind. And as a result, we worked collaboratively with CMNCP to establish a flexible method that would allow participants the space to share openly and recognize that this could not always be done with city staff or consultants in the virtual room. This set us on a path where we began initial conversations with leaders and representatives from these various population groups. As Katie mentioned earlier, usually this was a nonprofit, potentially executive director, or kind of natural leader in the community, or individuals who had kind of emerged as leaders within their respective groups. And then in these conversations, we heard a willingness from these groups to support the work of the CSWB plan in a very active role. So this sent us back to the drawing board, and we explored the idea of allowing groups to conduct their own consultation sessions, and many took us up on the offer. Therefore, CMNCP created a facilitation guide for these groups to be able to lead their own conversations, and we ended up with many unique formats. Just a couple are kind of listed on the side there for each of the various consultation groups that occurred. And I'm pleased to be joined here today by Leroy from the Regina CMHA branch to be able to share his experience in partnering through the consultation process from their perspective. And we'll get to hear from him later. So one consultation group that particularly highlights a number of the unique approaches that we employed throughout the planning process is just honing in and with respect to the Indigenous consultations that we conducted. So of course, first and foremost, we engaged with our elders and knowledge keepers in the community. However, we were having early conversations, and in those conversations, it was suggested to us that we consider doing separate sessions for men and women. So we did. Additionally, we also worked with a male and a female community leader for each respective group to help co-facilitate these sessions with the help of CMNCP. As a project team, we were also discussing other groups that we should be engaging, and we recognized and found that we were noticing many figures in our community acting in both formal and informal roles to support their communities. This led us to define 2 additional groups in consultation with these key community leaders, and this included a session on Indigenous women leaders, as well as service agencies that service Indigenous people, as well as Indigenous service providers. And in these 2 consultations, we partnered with a local Indigenous service agency known as All Nations Hope Network to host these sessions with an in-person component. When this occurred in the spring of 2021, where in Saskatchewan, we did see an easing of some COVID restrictions, and we were able to offer that as an option. And because of this, one of the really meaningful pieces that came out of this was that we were able to have an elder present in the room for these consultations, but also medicines available for participants. And the other kind of key piece here was that all participants that participated in these consultations were also offered tobacco for their participation. One last session here that was also developed under the Indigenous consultation kind of umbrella was a session exploring missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This explored the relevance of this topic to safety and well-being planning here in Regina. And so this session was hosted with an Indigenous service agency known as RITSIS, or Regina Treaty Status Indian Services. And they are an agency that has been deeply involved in supporting the inquiry when it was here in Saskatchewan, as well as been heavily engaged and involved in ongoing work to support families of individuals that have gone missing or have lost their lives due to violence. So in order to not require these family members in this consultation to relive or reshare their stories, a session was held that actually focused on policy solutions. And families were able to attend in person at that time, and it was facilitated by the service agency with myself and CMNCP being able to join virtually and hold greater space for those individuals to explore their stories. And then, so of particular relevance to the Indigenous consultations, I just do want to make quick note that great attention to protocol and ceremony is certainly needed to respectfully and properly complete these processes. We learned many things throughout the process, and as we continued to identify sessions, more and more pieces were revealed to us, and we did engage in a ceremony to kind of kick off most of these Indigenous consultations, and that was a recommendation that in fact came from community to ensure that we were really doing things in the right way, but also being led by spirit and protocol in the proper ways. So we did end up offering a sweat lodge ceremony that we partnered with All Nations Hope to do, and this occurred in that spring timeframe. And then we also engaged in many conversations with those kind of community leaders about who to talk to, how we would engage, and who we'd offer honorariums to, and how tobacco should be used as an offering throughout the process. And of course, because this was taking place with that backdrop of COVID, many of these processes had to be adapted, but it was critical that we did it in collaboration and consultation with community. I then just also want to touch briefly here on the re-engagement process that followed our community safety assessment. So coming out of this assessment, we were left with a number of local pressure points that were revealed. This included items such as crime and recreation and leisure, to racism, to service system provision more generally, and beyond. There was quite a large list. And then so in order to be able to scope this plan and the focus of it, we engaged sector representatives from the Regina Human Services Partnership. This group actually acted as the advisory committee for the development of the plan. And we worked with them in a process to distill down the many categories that we heard from our consultations to determine our highest priority items for immediate action. After this process then took place, we were left with 6 kind of clear priorities that you can see in the wheel on the right-hand side of your screen. And once we had these priorities in place, we then engaged in a verification and re-engagement plan that was conducted by the project team, where we took these priorities back to the community to check and kind of test their relevance. We then further worked with some key stakeholders with expertise in each of these different priority areas to refine the recommendations and the eventual action items that would be presented in the implementation plan of our CSWB plan. Now, I highlight this because I do believe it was a really critical consultation step in the development of the plan that we had not initially planned for, and I believe got us to a place of having not only a strong plan, but one that really resonated and made sense to individuals in Regina. And then just to conclude my presentation here today, I'll leave you with only a couple of my key takeaways from being a part of this process. So first is that intention really does drive outcome. We tried to be very thoughtful in our approach at every step, and as a result, we uncovered many items as we went, and this took additional time, but it did allow us to ensure our activities were always in alignment with our outcomes and our objectives as a project team. Now, this time invested also allowed us to build trust in our relationships with the community. And much to my colleagues from Strathcona County, I think this was really important, as these established relationships not only were beneficial to the development of the plan, but I hope we'll be able to continue to build that momentum and keep folks engaged and help us collectively as a community achieve the goals of the plan as we go forward through implementation. Additionally, here, the third point I have is that our re-engagement plan did further strengthen the overall process of our CSWB plan. And then I just want to note that COVID was in fact an opportunity that did push us to deeply think about how and why we were engaging our community in this process. In some ways, it was a burden in that it resulted in the fact that we weren't able to deliver the consultations maybe the way we would have initially envisioned. But in other ways, it allowed us to reach more individuals and do more than if we had been restricted to a greater extent in regards to travel budgets and whatnot. So with that, I just want to conclude my presentation today, and thank you all for allowing me to come. I look forward to further discussion in the Q&A, and I'll toss it back to Katie at this time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. And as someone who's obviously pretty involved in this process as well, I will definitely say that I think Regina's approach to consultations in general, and also particularly with the Indigenous community, is a great example for other communities looking to engage in this work as well. So, all right. So our final panelist, I'm just going to share my screen, is Leroy Behrend. So he is, oh, let me just make sure. Can everyone see the screen again?
No.
Oh, I guess I should probably hit share screen. That would help, wouldn't it? There we go. How's that? Can you see it now? Okay, awesome. So Leroy is currently the executive director at the CMHA Regina branch. He grew up in South Africa and graduated with a master's degree in psychology from the University of Johannesburg. He worked in the National Defence Force as a psychologist before joining the South African Transport Services, where he fulfilled several roles, including training and development consultant and management development consultant. Apologies. In the 1990s, Leroy spent years in the private education sector before starting and running a private psychology practice with a focus on stress, depression, anxiety, and trauma. Time was also spent working for the national airline, which included being part of a team selecting airline pilots. In November 2008, Leroy left South Africa to join a not-for-profit organization in Winnipeg, working as a behavior consultant. And during the years in Winnipeg, he developed a special interest in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, attending FASD training in Portland, Oregon, and several international conferences in Canada. In February 2018, he moved to Regina and joined the Regina branch of the Canadian Mental Health Association. So I'd like to welcome Leroy, and I will now turn it over to you for your presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Katie. You do have the slides there. I'll just run through a couple of them. But I think just there's an idea that we need to have just a bit of focus in terms of where we're going to go and some of the things I want to touch on. And that will give you a bit of structure for our 10 or 12 minutes that we have. But if we look at our branch, and I'm very particular when I talk about Canadian mental health branch, and you'll see why in a bit, but we have a particular mission to meet the needs of those in the community living with mental illness through accessing programs, education and awareness, advocacy, but also to integrate so that they can improve their mental health, and we're supporting them on their recovery journey from mental illness. So we're wanting to see a mentally healthy group of people in a healthy society. But more specifically, if you look at what we are doing, we're providing services and programs contributing to the healthier community of our members. And that totals close to 1,300 people in total. And these are people who are managing a life with a mental illness, but are also experiencing barriers, which, and I've just listed a few of them, but in particular, it's low self-esteem. Sometimes there's social communication challenges, as well as obvious challenges because of the mental health component to employment and even access to some educational opportunities. Now, when I talk about us as a branch, where we're located, it's on the edge of the downtown, very well located in terms of transportation and access to the city transit. So we're offering a drop-in center where our group of members can just arrive anytime between the hours of 9 and 4, Mondays through Fridays. We also offer a vocational program, so we're seeking to address that issue of confidence, providing employment opportunities within the branch before moving people into the community where possible. And I emphasize the Regina branch because our Canadian Mental Health Association division office for Saskatchewan is also in Regina and literally a block away from us. And we're one of the oldest charitable organizations in the country. We're serving over 330 communities presently. So that just gives you some of a bit of us. But then specifically the people that we call our members. They are people, like I said, managing a life with a mental illness. Whatever that mental illness is, and they've been referred to us either by a physician, their psychiatrist, for example. It could be a community service worker or someone even at the mental health clinic. But we've also seen what we call self-referral of people walking by, curious, and then having interactions with us and meeting criteria because of the mental illness component. So as a result, when it came to going through a process of asking questions, and those were neatly all set out for us, our finding was very clear that there's not a lot of trust for strangers. Less trust even, unfortunately, in our police service and for people that have not proven themselves or with whom they do not have a relationship. And that was, for me, fundamental, because we cannot, and as much as we wanted to include other people, we could not. And there was a real reluctance for people to get involved or participate. So the process that we used, I've just listed some of them there. I engaged on a top-down process. So after we had had our consultation in January of 2020, this survey became available online. So I encouraged all the staff to complete this survey before we engaged with any of the members. What I'm looking for is an inclusivity, and that then the staff in their interactions with the members can relate to the survey, even though the staff will have done it online, and that there's more of a, and I just put it in inverted commas, that there's more a relatable component of staff to member. And we were provided with a poster that we put up in our branch. It was in several prominent places. And that was just to create an interest, create an awareness that we are participating in a process. And it showed on the poster that participants would be receiving a gift card. And that, of course, is always a draw card. And once we had people expressing an interest, I got staff to spend one-on-one quality time with those interested members. There is a consent form, which is necessary, but then the staff would go through the questions with our membership and just writing down what their responses were. And it was done, like I say, one-on-one. So we kept a record of everything that was being said to us. And for other people who didn't participate or who wanted to at least think about participation, we had a PowerPoint slide put up where people could see some of the questions and just start thinking about if they wanted to participate, but not only that, how it would make them feel to do that. Because when we were engaging in the process, we found that there were certain elements that came out, and it was of particular importance that we had to use a lot of empathy with our members. Once we sat down and started talking to people and gave them the opportunity to answer those questions, we even found sometimes that people wanted to change their mind, and that we would respect based on the consent form. So that if somebody found it was becoming too close to home or was making them feel a little bit uncomfortable, then we would pause. And if they wanted to come back to it at a later stage, we would. And we had to take that into account. So not only did they change their mind, sometimes they would give us the consent form and then just withdraw participation. So we had to be okay with that as well. We also needed to go at the pace of the participant or the member who was answering the question, because sometimes it evoked stories. That in itself is a narrative and sometimes very helpful, but it did also have other consequences where people were being triggered by some of the questions, and that could have led people to also stop participating. So we would slow down. Sometimes they would not want to answer a particular question. They changed their minds. And sometimes people just, when we would ask, do you have any suggestions, which is one of the questions, they might not have an answer for that question. And they would come back to us sometimes a day or two later with a response and say, you know, I'd thought about that. So it was a very fluid process, and we couldn't pin it down to something that needed to start and finish within a particular time frame. And it was very insightful too, to be able to continue developing a relationship with people that we are supporting on a day-to-day basis. So once we had gone through all of those people who had participated in the process, and we still found people, of course, at the end asking if it was too late. What we provided back through to Katie and her group was what we've called the raw format. So it was the words that the members used. It was how they had described them, their experiences. We didn't categorize things. So there were pages of documentation that was returned. And it was a page, sometimes more, of the responses from each of the participants. So nowhere did we code it or categorize it or identify particular themes or issues at all. And of course, the most important thing for our participants was waiting for their gift cards to come through to them, because they don't let you forget. And that it's only right that we follow through with what we've said we would do. And I'm still getting people saying to me, you know, those things are happening. So people who participated seem to have held on to some of the thoughts and are looking around them. So I think, Kelly, from a city's point of view, the responses have been noted and they are looking at progress. So I think that's just a very practical way in which we went about it, trying to be as inclusive as possible with a group of people that sometimes is transient and challenging, but I think rewarding nonetheless when we were getting some of this information and hearing where people are at and what their experiences were. So that's pretty much a frontline exposure or feedback as to how we went about it here at Regina. And down at the bottom there is my email address. So if there's anyone who would like anything specific, please feel free to email me directly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leroy. And it's really great to hear from someone who has actually worked as a partner in this process and conducted the consultations on their own and share that experience with us. So thank you so much for your presentation. And just a note for everyone too, so what we'll do is when we do the follow-up email, we will include the contact information for all of the presenters in case you do want to reach out. So if you don't get the information off the slides, or if someone didn't provide it in their slides and you want to reach out, we will have that information for you, so not to worry. All right, so now we have about 20 minutes left that we have allotted for a Q&A period. So what we will do is we will open things up for discussion and questions for the panelists. So I think there's a couple things in the chat, but feel free, you can either type in the chat box or just use the hand icon and we'll get to you and we'll kind of go back and forth that way. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so people can actually see each other here. All right, and then we will begin. So as we're getting started, I did see that there was one question in the chat, so I will just go there first. So Colleen from the city of Surrey, she was asking Laurel and Michelle, will you be sharing the coding process that you had talked about?
I can jump in and answer that one, Michelle. Please, if there's anything that I miss, please feel free to join in. But we'd be happy to talk about our coding process. And if you're able to share our contact information, Katie and Audrey, after the presentation, I invite anyone to get in touch with me and I can share details about how we move forward in the process. There's also a short high-level description in our What We Heard report that's coming out right away. And so we just wanted to include that as part of being true to our principle of accountability. But I'll really quickly describe what our process consisted of. So if you think about doing a puzzle with like thousands and thousands of pieces, that's a really good metaphor for our process. So if you think about that stage where you dump your puzzle onto the table and you start to turn the pieces over and look at them and just get as familiar as you can with each piece, that's what our open coding was about. So we talked about going through every morsel of data. So every single thought, meaning unit that was shared with us by engagement participants, we paid attention to it and we attached a code to it, which was a label that determined what it was about. Then we started to do the next stage, which is like the stage in the puzzle where you start to move your pieces around into the border pieces, and maybe there's a house, maybe there's a tree. Start to group things that have some kind of relationship to each other. So we grouped codes that had some kind of relationship to each other. So maybe they were about different experiences related to safety, for example, but they all had to do with the idea of safety. So we ended up, first of all, with thousands of codes. We narrowed that down over time to 6 key themes or 6 key categories. And then we spent some time diving below the surface and we looked for the underlying ideas, sort of the latent meaning that held all the categories together and was the story of the data. And that's what we've presented in our What We Heard document.
Awesome. Thank you, Laurel. And I see a few comments in the chat. Sounds like what we did and we found 10 themes. Okay, so it was a similar process that others have used as well. Great. Liz, I see that you have your hand up if you want to go ahead and ask the question that you were.
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much. My name is Liz Wickful. I'm with Ottawa's Guiding Council on Mental Health and Addictions, and my co-director, Sahada Lolo, is here, and our research analyst, Sarah John, is on the call. So we're very interested to hear what you're doing because we're actually just doing our consultations now. And a lot of the principles are the same. So we're really happy to see that that you're our people. So that's great. And working a lot with people with lived experience and so on. So my question was actually for Kelly. When you talked about re-engaging with people and going back to validating what you had heard, could you talk a little bit about that process and what percentage of people did you talk to, and anything that you can share with us would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned in the presentation, it was kind of a step that we added on to the very end of our kind of process overall, and where most of the work that we had been doing was driven and done by CMNCP, where we had brought them on to bring on that additional capacity. This was something that emerged from our senior leadership, and they said, well, what are you going to do on this piece? And we were like, well, that wasn't a part of our initial plan, but we took that back and we said, okay, how can we do this and fold it into what we're doing? This was a kind of a piece that we as city administration picked up. So the process as it kind of unfolded was that we had our priorities. We had, from input from CMNCP, a really strong set of kind of recommendations and action items that we had started to build that were intended to be put into our final plan as a implementation plan for how we're going to drive and what are those steps that we can start taking as a community, as a city, as organizations, so on and so forth. And so we had this drafted, but we were kind of seeing and thinking that there might be gaps, and this would maybe be a really great anchoring piece for going back and kind of testing and retesting, because ultimately CSWB plans and the implementing of them really require that collaborative, coordinated effort. And so if we're presenting something that isn't making sense or resonating, particularly with subject matter experts out in the field doing this work and driving it, then it's gonna fall flat, right? So we took, and a lot of these learnings I think came out of recent other plans that we had developed. You know, the city has taken on, cultural plans, recreation plans. We have a plan to end homelessness that we're all kind of also feeding in some of those learnings. But on that re-engagement piece, what it ended up looking like was we had kind of this drafted list of recommendations and actions for each priority area. And so if I can just pick on like the domestic violence and intimate partner violence priority area, what we did for that was we went and looked at kind of all the community leaders that work in this area, and we just simply listed them out, as many as that we could identify, and we kind of asked around, who are we missing, and we just pulled them together with a group, and we presented the recommendations and actions as were, which was kind of vulnerable on our part. It's draft version, it's not ready for the public, but we just wanted to have a very open conversation. And I think back to those conversations, and they were so wonderful. The feedback we received right then and there was phenomenal. And so really we just took that, what I would usually do, because it was kind of added on to our process. It ended up in a few additional man hours, and I would take that home at the end of the day, and I would just review every single one of my notes and see where that fit and moved it all around. And as a result, it was included in the final version. And when we took it back as kind of a final review for that group, there often was very little ongoing feedback there. So I think we really ended with a solid kind of implementation plan to go forward there. So yeah, it was very iterative, and kind of informal conversations, but really opened the floor for just that very open feedback so that they could know, but then that also allowed them in the end to see their input into the plan in a very concrete way. So yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you, Liz, for your question. I see in the chat, Holly asked, how did you define well-being and safety? And Holly, I'm just wondering if you can clarify if there was a particular person that question was directed to, because it isn't mentioned right now.
No, there's no particular person that's not mentioned to.
Okay, so shall I open it up to the panelists and see if they can respond to that and get their perspectives on that?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
I can begin with an answer to that question from our community perspective. Our answer to that question is, in a sense, we didn't define safety and well-being because we wanted to see what the definition was that emerged from the voices of our community members through the engagement. And so that is not to say that we weren't familiar with the literature about safety and well-being and the common domains, and CMNCP's indicator framework has been incredibly helpful to us. So we were aware of those things, but we tried to put them aside when we were doing our engagement and analyzing the data, so that we could see maybe what things were emerging from the conversation that weren't usually kind of in our line of sight. And I'm just looking at the page from our draft What We Heard document that's talking about our theme of community safety, for example. And something that we learned was that in our community, and maybe this is common in other communities, or we have this in common with other communities, is that our participants told us that a really critical part of safety for them is about good relationships. And I'm reading from our What We Heard, actually. A community where people can show up as their authentic selves without fear of harm, rejection, exclusion, or discrimination. We want to belong and feel connected to the people and places we call home. And we heard many quotes and examples from people in our community that pointed to us coming up with a definition of safety that encapsulated this. And we did the same thing with well-being. So we defined well-being, eventually coming out of the voices, the learning, the expertise of our community members.
It's a really good question, at least from our perspective, because, you know, I resonate much with what Laurel shared, in that we didn't give a hard definition, at least from the outset. In a lot of our communications of going to community and saying, you know, hey, we're engaging in this. Some of it was directed by that council motion where it tied, you know, some of the social issues that we were seeing in our community with understanding that these, if we're to address them, we're to take a holistic and comprehensive approach to improving well-being, and safety kind of being kind of a core element to that, was kind of how we approached it, at least in the beginning. Now, there were, you know, resources and guides that we had also been referencing. CMNCP has a great guide on well-being, the domains. I think it's in relation to the one on survey development. And so those 8 or 10 domains of well-being and the indicators and outcomes there are one thing that also often ground me in what is well-being and help me in communicating that back to community. But yeah, I can't say we took a strong definition from the outset and wanted that to be defined by the community, so that we could understand from the community's perspective how we can address it in the best way possible. But in the plan, in the final version of it, we do give a bit of a background on the community safety wellbeing framework and kind of what it is, so that we can have a common understanding for an approach going forward.
Leroy, I see you unmuted. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, further to that, there was no definitions given. We left it with the statements that were provided, and it was very personalized. It was individualized, so the person could indicate where they feel safe and happy or unsafe. It was their experiences, and from that we got a wide range of things that we would not have anticipated. Somebody even said, for example, what makes them feel unsafe? It's graffiti. Now, who would have known? So I think it was important not to put it too narrow and to try and define it, but to leave it for a subjective or personal interpretation from their experiences.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question? Also, I just want to read Michelle, thank you so much for the comment. She said, I'd like to express to the group that this conference was invaluable from my perspective in terms of the quality of speakers and the learnings that our staff gained from the event. It is time well spent. So thank you. And I want to echo that. We very much appreciate all of you participating and speaking as well. We find this topic, of course, very important, and that's why we're doing this. And so it's great to hear that feedback. I think we have time for a couple more questions. We have about 5 minutes left. So if anybody else has anything they would like to ask the panelists, please feel free to either raise your hand or put them in the chat. Just gonna scroll through here. Also, Leroy, I just wanted to mention that when you were speaking, Lona, I believe her name, has mentioned that it was helpful, the observation regarding who should ask the lived experience questions and the importance of that in the relationship building process for the participants as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. I'm just going to scroll and make sure I don't miss anybody here. All right, well, I think what we'll do then is I don't see any other questions. So I think since we have a couple minutes, maybe I'll give the panelists a chance to kind of provide some final closing remarks or thoughts based on what we've talked about today, and then we'll wrap things up if that works. So maybe we'll just go in order of the presentations to keep it simple. So Michelle and Laurel, if there's anything else you want to end with, feel free.
I don't think so. I think, you know, maybe the gift of time for folks. Thank you.
I'll just add that I echo Michelle's comments. I really learned a lot from the other presenters and from the questions. I especially appreciated the conversation about how different communities approach defining or not safety and well-being. Thank you for sharing the question and those insights.
And I would just add that, you know, I really appreciated the time spent here and the great participation of folks. You know, there's quite a few that have been able to jump on and join. It's always, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some of the work, but learn from other communities, and CMNCP as an organization really does offer some fantastic opportunities for us to do so. So yeah, I feel like I learned just as much as maybe I said. So I'll leave it at that. And if there are questions or further conversations communities would like to have, by all means, do reach out and we'd love to connect.
I think from our end, you know, from the frontline people, it was a very insightful experience, very beneficial. And Kelly, Katie, your group, thank you very much. And good opportunity to be able to give that feedback to you and hopefully help other people who are going down the same road as us, not to make the same mistakes, but maybe learn a whole lot more from us.
Absolutely. All right, well, I will wrap things up a little bit early. So I just want to extend a sincere thank you from ourselves. First of all, to the panelists, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your experience with us today. We very much appreciate your time and all the knowledge that you shared with us. And to everyone who attended as well, thank you so much for being here. We hope that you found this time informative and helpful. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day and take care.